Imagine a scene that belongs on a holiday greeting card. A man dressed in the bright red velvet and white fur of Santa Claus walks down the main street of a bustling American town. Children wave with excitement, and parents smile at the festive sight. Now imagine that same figure pulling out a pistol and storming into a bank vault. This is not the plot of a dark Hollywood comedy, but a very real and very violent event that took place in the history of the United States. It is a story where the difference between a successful heist and a life in prison came down to a single overlooked detail. The getaway car, the most crucial tool in the criminal arsenal, was about to betray them in the most embarrassing way possible. The year was 1927, and the location was Cisco, Texas. This was a time and place defined by the roaring energy of the oil boom. Money was flowing through the streets like the crude oil pumped from the ground nearby. Banks were overflowing with cash, and the First National Bank of Cisco was no exception. It stood as a pillar of wealth in the center of town. The sheer volume of currency moving through its tellers made it a tempting target for men who preferred stealing to working. The town was alive with commerce, and the holiday season added a layer of chaotic joy to the atmosphere. It was the perfect cover for a crime that required blending in while standing out. Marshal Ratliff was a man who knew the inside of a prison cell better than he knew an honest day of labor. He had been paroled recently and was eager to return to his old ways. Ratliff was a known figure in Cisco, having been convicted of a previous robbery in the same town. He knew that showing his face would lead to immediate recognition by the local law enforcement. He needed a disguise that would render him invisible in plain sight. As Christmas approached, an idea formed in his mind that was both brilliant and twisted. Who would suspect the embodiment of Christmas cheer of harboring malicious intent? He decided to don the suit of Santa Claus. Ratliff recruited 3 accomplices to help him execute this audacious plan. Henry Helms and Robert Hill were hardened criminals who were ready for violence. The third man was Louis Davis, a relative novice compared to the others. He was a safecracker by trade, but lacked the steel nerves required for an armed robbery of this magnitude. The group gathered in Wichita Falls to finalize their strategy. They planned the route and the timing and the weapons. They secured a getaway car, which was a stolen vehicle they believed was fast enough to outrun the local sheriff. Every detail seemed accounted for, except for one logistical oversight that would doom them all. On the morning of December 23, 1927, the gang drove into Cisco. The town was teeming, with shoppers preparing for the holiday. Ratliff donned the Santa Claus suit he had prepared. It was a cheap costume, but effective enough from a distance. He pulled the beard up high and lowered his hat. His accomplices, dressed in plain clothes, trailed behind him as he walked down the avenue. Children flocked to Ratliff asking for presents and tugging at his red coat. He patted their heads and played the part while his heart pounded with the anticipation of the violence to come. He was walking straight toward the First National Bank. The moment they entered the bank, the illusion shattered. Ratliff drew his weapon, and the other 3 men pulled out their guns. The festive atmosphere evaporated, instantly replaced by the cold terror of a holdup. Customers screamed and tellers froze in place. Ratliff barked orders, his voice muffled slightly by the fake beard. He forced the bank employees to open the vault, while his partners herded the terrified civilians into a corner. They began stuffing sacks with cash and bonds. The sheer amount of money was staggering, but time was already slipping away. A woman named Mrs. Blassingame and her daughter had seen the men enter and slipped out a side door to alert the police. Chief of Police G.A. Bedford received the call and immediately rallied his officers. In a town like Cisco, where everyone carried a firearm, The response was not limited to just the police force. Citizens grabbed their hunting rifles and pistols from their trucks and shops. Within minutes, the bank was surrounded by a heavily armed posse of lawmen and vigilantes. The robbers inside were still gathering the loot when the first shots rang out. Glass shattered and bullets chipped away at the brick facade. The gang realized they were trapped. The easy robbery had turned into a siege, and their only way out was through a wall of gunfire. Ratliff and his crew made a desperate decision. They grabbed two young girls as human shields to cover their exit. This cowardly act caused the crowd outside to hesitate. Using the hostages as cover, the four bandits moved toward their parked car. The air was thick with smoke, and the sound of gunfire was deafening. Despite the human shields, the citizens continued to fire at the robbers when they had a clear shot. Bullets struck the getaway car and punctured the tires and smashed the windows. The gang managed to shove the hostages and the money bags into the vehicle, but the car was already significantly damaged. They sped away from the bank with the police and angry citizens in hot pursuit. The getaway car was limping. The tires were shredded and the engine was straining. They realized quickly that this vehicle would not get them to safety. They needed a new car immediately. As luck would have it, they spotted a 14-year-old boy driving an Oldsmobile. They forced the car to stop and ordered the boy out at gunpoint. This was their salvation. A fresh car with no bullet holes and good tires. They frantically transferred the heavy bags of money and their hostages into the Oldsmobile. The transfer was chaotic. In the confusion and adrenaline of the moment, they left behind one crucial bag of money in the first car. But they had the hostages and they had a working vehicle. Ratliff took the wheel of the Oldsmobile and gunned the engine. They left the town of Cisco behind them, speeding down the dirt roads into the open Texas countryside. They believed they had escaped the immediate ring of fire. The pursuit cars were falling behind, and the open road promised freedom. The adrenaline began to fade, slightly replaced by the grim satisfaction of survival. Then came the moment that turned this tragedy into a farce. As they drove down the country road, the engine of the Oldsmobile began to sputter. Ratliff looked down at the dashboard. The fuel gauge was hovering on empty. In their haste to carjack a vehicle, they had not checked the fuel level. The boy they stole it from had been running on fumes. The realization hit them like a physical blow. They were in the middle of nowhere with a car full of hostages and stolen cash, and they were out of gas. The most carefully laid plans had been undone by a few gallons of fuel. Panic set in immediately. The car rolled to a stop on the side of the road. They could hear the distant roar of the approaching posse. They had no choice but to abandon the vehicle. They grabbed what cash they could carry and left the rest. They also had to leave the hostages behind, as they could not move fast enough on foot with them. The four men ran into the dense brush and cactus fields of the Texas landscape. The glorious getaway had devolved into a desperate foot race against an entire town of angry pursuers. The Santa Claus suit, which had been a clever disguise, was now a bright red target. The terrain was unforgiving. The men were dressed in city clothes, and Ratliff was still wearing parts of the Santa costume. They scrambled through mesquite and brambles, tearing their clothes and skin. The weather began to turn, with a cold winter rain starting to fall. They were exhausted and terrified. The posse was closing and using dogs to track their scent. The robbers split up in an attempt to confuse the trackers. Louis Davis, the safe cracker, had been severely wounded during the initial shootout at the bank. He was slowing them down significantly. Night fell and the temperature dropped. The men were freezing and huddled in the darkness. The manhunt for the Santa Claus Bank robbers had become national news. Newspapers across the country were printing the story of the festive heist gone wrong. In the woods, the reality was grim. Davis was losing blood rapidly. His accomplices, realizing he was a liability, made the cold decision to leave him behind. They propped him up against a tree and continued their flight into the darkness. Davis would later be found by the authorities and would succumb to his wounds. The remaining 3 men managed to steal another car the following morning, but their luck remained poor. They crashed that vehicle after a high-speed chase and were forced back on foot. For days, they evaded capture, living off the land and hiding in culverts. The police cordoned off the entire area. It was the largest manhunt in Texas history up to that point. Every road was blocked, and every farmhouse was on alert. The men were starving and dehydrated. The sheer physical toll of the escape was breaking them down one by one. Ratliff was the first of the remaining trio to be captured. He was found hiding in a riverbed, exhausted and battered. The police stripped him of his weapons and dragged him back to civilization. The town of Cisco was waiting. The anger in the community was palpable. They had seen their town shot up and their neighbors threatened. The sight of the man who had mocked Christmas by wearing the Santa suit fueled a desire for immediate justice. The police had to protect Ratliff from the mob that gathered outside the jailhouse. Shortly after Ratliff was caught, Henry Helms and Robert Hill were apprehended in a nearby town. They had tried to blend in, but their disheveled appearance gave them away. The gang was reunited behind bars. The stolen money was largely recovered, scattered across the various abandoned vehicles and the path of their flight. The heist was a total failure. They had lost a member of their crew and lost the money and lost their freedom. All because they failed to check the gas gauge of a stolen Oldsmobile. The legal proceedings were swift. The state of Texas had no sympathy for armed bank robbers, especially those who endangered children and mocked a religious holiday. Marshall Ratliff was sentenced to death. His accomplices received life sentences. But the story of Marshall Ratliff did not end with the judge's gavel. He was a man who refused to accept his fate. While awaiting his execution on death row, he began to feign insanity. He acted out in bizarre ways, hoping to be transferred to an asylum rather than the electric chair. His act worked to an extent. He was transferred to the Eastland County Jail for a lunacy hearing. This was a fatal mistake by the authorities. The people of Eastland County were still furious about the robbery and the shootout. The presence of the Santa Claus robber in their local jail reignited the public anger. On November 19, 1929, a mob formed outside the jail. They were not there to protest. They were there to take the law into their own hands. The memory of the violence in Cisco was still fresh in their minds. Ratliff attempted one final escape during his time in the Eastland jail. He managed to acquire a gun and shot a jailer in a desperate bid for freedom. This act sealed his fate. The mob outside stormed the jail. They overpowered the guards and dragged Ratliff from his cell. There was no trial this time. They took him to a utility pole in a vacant lot behind the theater. In a grim and violent end to the saga, Marshall Ratliff was lynched by the citizens. It was a brutal conclusion to a crime that had started with a costume of joy. The legacy of the Santa Claus Bank robbery is a strange mix of tragedy and absurdity. It led to changes in banking security across Texas. But more interestingly, it led to a psychological shift. For years afterwards, the sight of a Santa Claus in Cisco would cause unease rather than happiness. The town had been traumatized by the image. The crime highlighted the desperation of the era and the violent culture of the Texas oil boom. It remains one of the most infamous crimes in the history of the Southwest. The story serves as a dark lesson in logistics. Criminals often spend months planning the complex aspects of a heist. They study the vault and the guard rotations and the alarm systems. Yet history is filled with stories where the simplest details cause the collapse of the entire enterprise. A flat tire or a dead battery, or in this case, an empty gas tank. The difference between a master criminal and a captured convict is often just a few gallons of gasoline. The image of the robber standing on a lonely Texas road, staring at a fuel gauge reading empty, is almost comical if not for the violence that surrounded it. It represents the ultimate failure of foresight. They had successfully stormed a bank and fought off a posse and secured hostages. They had done the hard part, but they failed to account for the mundane reality that cars need fuel to move. That oversight cost lives and destroyed their future. Today, the First National Bank building still stands in Cisco, Texas. It is a historical landmark that bears the scars of that day. Visitors can still see the bullet holes in the brick and the interior. It serves as a physical reminder of the day Santa Claus brought a gun to town. The story is retold every year not as a Christmas tale, but as a warning. It is a staple of Texas folklore, blending the lines between true crime and legend. The Santa Claus Bank robbery stands out in the annals of crime, not because of the amount of money stolen or the brilliance of the plan, but because of the sheer bizarre nature of the events. It combines the innocence of a holiday icon with the grit of a Western shootout. It features a comedy of errors involving cars and gas that feels like fiction. But the mugshots and the gravestones and the court records prove that it was all too real. As we look back on this event from the safety of the present, it is easy to focus on the blunder of the gas tank. It is the detail that makes the story memorable. But we must also remember the terror of the citizens of Cisco. For them, it was not a funny story about a bad getaway driver. It was a day of survival. The police officers and armed citizens who fought back showed immense courage in the face of automatic weapon fire. The accomplices Henry Helms and Robert Hill eventually faded into obscurity within the prison system, though Hill later escaped and was recaptured. Their lives were defined by that single day in 1927. They were forever known as the men who robbed a bank with Santa Claus. The infamy followed them until their deaths. They were part of a gang that could have been successful if they had just checked the dashboard of that Oldsmobile. This case illustrates the fragility of criminal plans. No matter how ruthless or prepared a gang might be, they are still subject to the laws of physics and mechanics. An engine will not run without fuel regardless of how much stolen money is in the back seat. The universe has a way of punishing oversight. For the Santa Claus gang, the punishment was swift and absolute. They ran out of gas and they ran out of luck. In the end, the story of the getaway car that ran out of gas is more than just a trivia fact. It is a narrative about hubris. Marshal Ratliff believed he could outsmart the law by dressing as a saint. He believed he could outrun the consequences of his actions. But reality caught up with him on a dirt road outside of town. The empty tank was a symbol of his empty ambitions. It was the moment the fantasy of the perfect crime collided with the hard truth of reality. So the next time you see a heist movie where the getaway driver is waiting with the engine running, remember the Santa Claus Bank robbery. Remember that in real life things go wrong. Cars break down and fuel runs out and plans fall apart. The line between a legendary escape and a prison sentence is often drawn by the needle on a gas gauge. And in the case of Marshal Ratliff, that needle pointed to zero.